going to cover up that clock, otherwise I'll keep talking until 11 o'clock today. So the passage today is Matthew 2, starting in Matthew 2, starting in verse 1. And where I want to go with that is beginning with the providence of God. And then we'll talk about this idea of giving presents to God. The Magi came and they gave presents to Jesus, but I believe each day we can give God a present. So beginning in all throughout chapter 2, we see God's providence providing for the family of Jesus. Mary and Joseph and Jesus were about to flee to Egypt. And before they did that, the Magi came. And they brought with them gold and frankincense and myrrh. Have you ever wondered how Joseph was able to leave so quickly after his dream? He had gold and frankincense and myrrh that could fund his trip to Egypt. And we can see that mainly in verses 13 through 18. But in verse 12, we have the Magi. After they bring these gifts, they were warned in a dream not to return to Herod. They departed to their own country another way. God was communicating to Mary in Luke 1 and 2 and communicating with Joseph in Matthew 1 and 2 many times in these dreams. And through those dreams, God led them exactly where they needed to go. You remember when Joseph was told, don't divorce this woman because she's pregnant by the Holy Spirit. And because he was a righteous man, he listened. And Mary was told not to worry. Mary was told what kind of person that Jesus would be. We have the Magi being led by a star. We've got Joseph in these later verses. He has to flee because in a dream, God tells him that Herod is about to kill him or to kill Jesus. And we know Herod eventually tried to kill Jesus, but ended up killing every male child under the age of 2. He was that upset about the possibility of this new king coming. And Jesus was prophesied to be that king. God provided for each person in that family all the way through, just like God is providing for us. This miracle that God would provide these Magi to these wise men from the east who could give Joseph these gifts and give Jesus these gifts so that they could leave town and go to Egypt. And Egypt for them was about 40 miles away. But if you knew that the governor was set out to kill your son, how far would you go into Egypt? I think they wouldn't have stopped there at the border. I think this was a long trip for them. I think they would have gotten about as far into Egypt as they possibly could. And you can read in 13 through 23, if you wanted to, about them finally coming back. It was yet another dream that told them it was safe. Herod had died, and so they could return. At each step, Joseph is following God's will. But at each step, it requires other people to follow God's will also. This whole process, all of chapter 1 and 2 of Matthew, all of chapter 1 and 2 of Luke, would read completely differently if Mary didn't trust in God. It would read completely differently if at any of these dreams Joseph decided not to listen. It would read completely differently if the wise men from the east did not listen to whatever was guiding them to look at this star in the first place. God providing every step of the way was perfect because God is perfect. It's weird how in our lives that God works out situations like that. Providential things that just happen by no luck of our own, no work of our own. We have no idea how they come up. I don't know if Brent told you guys how I ended up living in the parsonage. I I was sitting at Chick-fil-A one day when he wandered in, and he said, he asked me if I knew anybody who could use an apartment to live in. I said, well, we just happened to put in our notice. We're leaving where we live. And if not for living in the parsonage, I wouldn't be here preaching today. If not for Brent scheduling a vacation for this day, we wouldn't have a sermon on this passage right now. It's like God is working years in advance to work out every little detail of things that are going to happen if we follow His will. But we can mess that up if we stop listening. At any point in this story, it's different if someone stops listening. Our story is completely different if we stop listening. So it brings us to these presents. These wise men from the east were following the star and believing that they were coming towards this new king. They follow, they eventually, in verse 10, they see the star, they rejoice exceedingly with great joy, and going into the house, they see the child with Mary, his mother. They fall down and worshipped him. Then, opening their treasures, they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. If they believe that this person is so important, this Jesus is so important, that he would be the new king, that he was worthy of worship, they would have to know that these gifts are insufficient. That anyone deserving of worship deserves even far more than gold, frankincense, and myrrh. But that was what they could do. That was all they could provide. Does anybody remember being a child? I don't know if they did this. They did it in my school when I was growing up. But they would bring they called it Santa's Workshop. And they would have little presents, maybe $1, $2, or $3 presents that kids could come in. Their parents would give them money and they could come in and buy their parents a Christmas present. Did you ever try to buy your parents a Christmas present? It's hard to do because parents have everything. They've got what they need. And as a kid, we don't have much that we can offer. That's kind of how it is with God. God already has everything. Brent has probably told you guys that God owns the cattle on 1,000 hills, right? And he owns the hills too. Well, he used to say that when he was over at First Christian. You'll have to tell him that I said that. So God owns all of this, and there is nothing that we could give to God that would equal anything that God had. But we're still called to give something. When my dad was a kid, his family was very poor. And one Christmas, he asked for a pound of bacon. And he got it. And he fried it up in front of his brothers. And he ate every piece of it. But when he was an adult, he wanted different Christmas presents. Every year when I was growing up, he wanted the same 3 things. He wanted a clean house and 2 boys that behave. He never got the clean house. And he would be lucky if he got one of us to behave. Because those are kind of connected. If any of you have raised boys, you will never have a clean house if you don't have 2 boys that behave. And if you have 2 boys that behave, you might actually get a clean house occasionally. That's the way that it is for us. These gifts that we can give to God are all interconnected. The first and greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. The second is likened to it, love your neighbor as yourself. And then the big question, we've got 2 good gifts we can give God. We can give a love to God, and we can love the neighbor or the others that God has created, the other people that God has put in our lives. But now I want to find a third present because, ministers, we have to talk in threes. So we got to find what's the third greatest commandment. Maybe how about the Great Commission? That's a good third greatest. Go therefore, preach, teach, disciple. Bring others into the family of God. Those are the 3 things that we can give to God. And, a week late. We're a week after Christmas, but the Magi, they were 2 years late, so it's okay. Any day we want to start giving God this present is okay. Any day that we decide we want to change our lives and we want to start loving God more. Anytime we want to start to live out the kind of sacrifice that we're called to do in Romans 13, or to offer that sweet-smelling savor of praise and worship and prayer to God, we can do that. That is what we are called to do. That is the least that we can do for the God who created us, for the God who can orchestrate all of these things in our world. And just like my dad wanted two boys that behave, we ought to love one another. Because if we love our neighbor, it's a lot more likely that the neighbor will love us. If we love our fellow church members, it's a lot more likely that they love us. I remember I mentioned that he was lucky to get one well-behaved boy. If you have a well-behaved boy and a not-so-well-behaved boy that sit beside each other, you usually end up with two boys that don't behave. That's just the way that it works. If we love our neighbor, they will love us more. If we love our enemy, it's a lot less likely that they'll be our enemy. If we can love those who are the least of these, pretty soon I don't think they'll be the least of these anymore. Pretty soon they'll be part of the family. Pretty soon they'll be the kind of people that we hang out with all the time. Or if we're actually spreading the gospel, we're actually teaching other people about Jesus, we're actually discipling them to make disciples of their own, pretty soon we've grown the family of God. And we have more people sitting in here that we can love, and more people who are going to join us in eternity. More people who are now worshiping God. All of these things connect together and support one another. I want to flip back to verse 7, chapter 2, verse 7. Then Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them, and I'm going to read from the ESV, I think, but whatever's on the screen is fine. And ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word, that I too may worship him." After listening to the king, they went on their way. And this is when they discovered Jesus, and they give him the gift. In verse 12, being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed. We don't have verse 16 up there, but then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious. He sent and killed all the male children from Bethlehem and in all that region that were 2 years and under. He was so angry about this king that he killed all of these children. Within this whole story, everyone is doing what God called them to do, listening to the dreams. Immediately, if you follow when Joseph has each of these dreams, immediately after the dream, he goes and does something. And that's important for us. When we have a message from God, we ought to go and to do it. An example of that is verse 13. The angel appears to him and says, "Rise, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt." Verse 14, and he rose, took the child, and fled to Egypt. This is when God says it, we ought to go and to do it. But in this story, we have Herod, who is doing the exact opposite of what he's supposed to do. And because of Herod, this whole process has to happen. Instead of Jesus being raised in his hometown, instead of him growing up there, he had to spend the first couple years in Egypt. His family had to up and move twice, out there and then back, because of Herod. All of these lives were cut short because of Herod, because of jealousy, because of just pure evil, stopping what God had intended. But No one can stop what God is intending. All it did was slightly change things. Everyone who is connected to the story, besides Herod, does what they're supposed to do. And Herod is the one who does not get the blessing of following after God. Herod is the one that ultimately will die. And only by his death will Christ come back to that town. I think of him a little bit like Scrooge, I guess. He's the one preventing Christmas from being in that town, preventing Christ from being there. He's the one trying to stop it all. And we can be like that. We, as individual people, can stop other people from worshiping God. By our actions, by our words, by how we treat them, we can stop them from worshiping. We can stop people from loving one another by our words and our actions. A lot of times Christians try to reach out to people who are different, and other Christians criticize them, talk bad about them, try to stop them. A lot of times Christians try to do the Great Commission and try to disciple people and raise up the kids to be in the church and raise up the adults to be in leadership and encourage people to do more in the church or around their neighborhood, and other Christians stop them. Backbiting and gossip and criticism and quenching the spirit is what they're doing. They're doing the kind of thing that Herod would do. And none of us ought to live that way. We ought to be giving these three presents to God and encouraging one another to do the same. As long as today remains today, we ought to lift one another up. We ought to encourage one another, especially because the end is coming. Especially because we don't know the impact of what our words will be. We don't know how many people will spend eternity in heaven because of those things that we do, that bit that we give, that lesson that we teach, or that lesson that we listen to and share with somebody else. All of those things will echo through eternity because God is working each thing out. But each one of us can stop that. Each one of us can be the reason that people behind us don't come to faith. Or each one of us can be like Joseph. And when God says it, we do it. And when God calls us, we do it. When God commissions us, we do it. When Christ tells us to love, we love. And that's what we're supposed to do.
Thank John for that message. We appreciate it. In response this morning,